Jake Morrison stood in front of the mirror in his small quarters, looking at his reflection one last time. The face staring back at him was not his own. Blue skin covered his features, and his eyes had turned a deep purple color. Two small ridges ran along his forehead, and his ears had become pointed. The medical team on Earth had done their work well. He looked exactly like a Zephyrian. He touched his throat, feeling the small device that would change his voice. 3 months of surgery and training had led to this moment. Jake was about to enter the most dangerous place in the galaxy for a human, the galactic council chambers. The mission was simple in theory but deadly in practice. Jake had to get close to the 12 alien species that ruled most of the known galaxy. These aliens saw humans as violent and primitive. They had refused every request for humans to join their council. Earth's leaders needed to know why, and they needed to know what the aliens were planning. Jake picked up his datapad and walked toward the door. He had memorized hundreds of Zephyrian stories and customs. The Zephyrians were known as great storytellers, traveling from world to share tales of the past. It was the perfect cover for a spy. The transport ship landed on Nexus Prime 2 hours later. Jake stepped out and saw the massive city that housed the galactic government. Tall towers reached toward the clouds, and flying vehicles moved between them like metal birds. Aliens of all shapes and sizes walked the streets. Some had 4 arms. Others had tentacles instead of legs. A few looked almost human, but their skin was green or silver. Jake made his way to the council building. It was the largest structure on the planet, shaped like a giant crystal that caught the light from 3 different suns. Guards stood at every entrance. They were tall, gray beings with no hair and large black eyes. They scanned Jake with their devices but found nothing suspicious. Inside the building, Jake followed signs to the visitor registration area. A small alien with orange fur and 6 eyes looked up at him. "Purpose of visit?" the alien asked in a bored voice. "I am Keeper Zethmer of the Zephyrian Archives," Jake said, using the voice changer to sound exactly like a native Zephyrian. "I have come to observe the Great Council and perhaps share some of our ancient stories." The alien stamped a pass and handed it to Jake. Level 47. Do not disturb the proceedings. Jake took the elevator to the council chamber. The room was enormous, with seats arranged in a circle around a central speaking area. Each section was designed for a different alien species. Some had water-filled areas for aquatic beings, others had special atmosphere domes. He found a seat in the visitor section and looked around. The 12 council members were already in their places. Jake recognized them from his training files. There was Commander Zilthak from the Vorthan Empire, a reptilian being with sharp teeth and red eyes. Next to him sat Lyra Voss from the Centauri Federation, who looked almost human except for her silver hair and pale blue skin. The session began with reports from different worlds. Jake listened carefully, recording everything with a hidden device. He learned about trade disputes, territorial claims, and military movements. But he heard nothing about humans or Earth. Then Commander Zilthak stood up. His voice was deep and harsh when he spoke. "We have received another request from the human colonies," he said. "They want to establish what they call a diplomatic mission in the Outer Rim systems." Several council members made sounds of disapproval. A large insect-like alien clicked its mandibles in annoyance. "These humans expand too quickly," said another council member. "They have established colonies on 15 worlds in the past 10 years. And they fight constantly among themselves," added the aquatic delegate, speaking through a water-filled breathing device. "Their history is filled with wars and violence." Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was exactly the kind of information Earth needed to hear. Lyra Voss raised her hand to speak. "Perhaps we should study these humans more carefully before making decisions about them." Commander Zilthak's red eyes flashed. "What is there to study? They are a primitive species that has barely learned to travel between stars. They have no culture, no wisdom, no understanding of the greater universe." "I disagree," said a quiet voice from the back of the chamber. All eyes turned to Jake. He realized he had spoken without thinking. Now 12 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy were staring at him. You disagree? Commander Zilthak's voice was dangerous. And who are you to speak in this chamber? Jake stood up slowly. His heart was beating fast, but he kept his voice steady. I am Keeper Zethmer of the Zephyrian Archives. I have traveled to many worlds and heard many stories. Some of these stories speak of young species that seemed primitive but proved to be quite remarkable. The chamber fell silent. Jake knew he was taking a huge risk, but he also saw an opportunity. If he could make these aliens think differently about humans, he might accomplish more than just gathering intelligence. You spoke of culture and wisdom, Jake continued. Perhaps I could share a story that relates to this discussion. Commander Zilthak was about to refuse, but Liravos spoke first. I would like to hear this story. Several other council members nodded in agreement. The reptilian commander sat back down, clearly annoyed but unable to refuse without seeming rude. Jake walked to the center of the chamber. He looked around at the 12 alien faces watching him. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Long ago, he began, there was a small city-state on the Zephyrian homeworld. It was surrounded by a vast empire that wanted to conquer it. The empire had millions of soldiers, while the city had only a few hundred defenders. Jake paused, letting the image sink in. He was about to tell them the story of the Battle of Thermopylae, but they would hear it as an ancient Zephyrian legend. The emperor of the great empire sent a messenger to the small city. The messenger said, "Surrender now, and we will spare your lives. Fight us, and we will destroy you completely. Our arrows will blot out the sun." The aquatic delegate leaned forward in interest. Even Commander Zilthak seemed to be listening. The leader of the small city looked at the messenger and said, "Then we will fight in the shade." The people of the city chose to stand and fight, even though they knew they would die. Jake continued the story, describing how the defenders used the narrow mountain pass to their advantage. He told them about the sacrifice of the brave warriors who held the line while their people escaped. He spoke of honor, courage, and the willingness to die for what was right. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then Liravos spoke. That is a powerful story, Keeper Zethmer. It speaks of qualities that should be respected in any species. It is just an old legend, Commander Zilthak said dismissively. Pretty words about events that may never have happened. Perhaps, Jake replied carefully. But legends often contain truths about the nature of those who tell them. The session continued for another hour, but Jake noticed that several council members kept glancing at him. When it ended, Liravos approached him. I enjoyed your story, she said. Will you be attending future sessions? If I am welcome, Jake replied. You are welcome at my table, she said. Perhaps you have other stories to share? As Jake left the chamber, he felt both triumph and fear. He had succeeded in getting the council's attention, but he had also made himself visible to some very dangerous beings. Commander Zilthak's red eyes had followed him all the way to the exit, back in his quarters. Jake sent a coded message to Earth. First contact successful. Audience receptive to cultural exchange. Proceeding with Phase 2. He looked at himself in the mirror again. The blue-skinned Zephyrian face stared back at him. Tomorrow he would return to the council chamber with another story. And slowly, carefully, he would begin to change how the galaxy saw humanity. Jake woke up early on his third day at Nexus Prime. He had attended 2 more council sessions since his first story, and each time more aliens had listened to his tales. Word was spreading that the Zephyrian storyteller had interesting legends to share. He dressed carefully in his blue robes and checked his disguise in the mirror. The synthetic skin still looked perfect, and his voice changer was working normally. Jake had to be extra careful now. Success was making him visible, and visibility was dangerous for a spy. The council chamber was busier than usual when Jake arrived. Several trade disputes were on the schedule, and tensions were high between different species. Jake took his usual seat in the visitor section and watched the proceedings. The first argument was between the Vorthan Empire and the Crystalline Collective. The Crystallines were tall, transparent beings who looked like living glass. They accused the Vorthans of stealing mining rights on 3 different worlds. Commander Zilthek stood up, his red eyes flashing with anger. The Crystalline Collective signed those contracts willingly. If they did not read the terms carefully, that is their own fault. The Crystalline delegate, a being called Resonance 7, made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Your contracts were written in ancient Vorthan script. You knew we could not read them properly. The argument grew louder. Other council members began taking sides. Jake watched as the chamber divided into 2 groups, each supporting their allies. This was exactly the kind of division that could lead to war. Lyra Voss tried to calm the situation. Perhaps we should form a committee to review these contracts and find a fair solution. There is nothing to review, Commander Zelthik snarled. The contracts are legal and binding. Legal perhaps, but not honorable, Resonance 7 replied. The word honorable hung in the air like a challenge. Jake saw his chance. He stood up and cleared his throat. If I may, he said in his disguised voice, this discussion of honor reminds me of an ancient story. Commander Zilthek looked annoyed. We do not have time for stories, Keeper. We have real business to conduct. But Lyra Voss nodded to Jake. I would like to hear this story. Perhaps it will help us find wisdom in our current situation. Other council members murmured agreement. Jake noticed that even some of the aliens who had ignored him before were now paying attention. He walked to the center of the chamber. Long ago, Jake began, there was a great empire that controlled much of the known world. This empire was powerful and wealthy, but it was also hungry for more territory. Jake was about to tell them about the Roman Empire, but they would hear it as another Zephyrian legend. The empire sent its armies to conquer new lands. They built great roads and magnificent cities. They brought order to wild places and connected distant peoples through trade. The council members listened carefully. Jake could see that the Vorthans were pleased with this description of a strong empire. But the empire did something else. Jake continued. When they conquered new peoples, they did not destroy their cultures. Instead, they learned from them. They adopted the best ideas from each group they met. Jake described how the Romans had taken engineering techniques from one culture, art styles from another, and military tactics from a third. He told them about the roads that connected the empire, the aqueducts that brought water to cities, and the laws that protected citizens. The empire grew strong not just through conquest, Jake said, but through the wisdom of bringing different peoples together. They understood that diversity made them stronger, not weaker. When Jake finished, the chamber was quiet. Then Lyra Voss spoke. That is a beautiful story about the strength that comes from unity. Perhaps we can learn from this ancient empire. Commander Zilthek snorted. Pretty words, but the strong still rule the weak. That is the way of the universe, is it? Asked a new voice. Everyone turned to look at the speaker. It was Fleet Admiral Corinth from the Aquatic Coalition. He rarely spoke in council sessions, preferring to observe and listen. Please continue, Admiral, Lyra Voss said. I have been thinking about the Keeper's stories, Admiral Corinth said through his breathing device. They speak of strength, but not the kind of strength Commander Zilthek describes. They speak of the strength that comes from choosing to do what is right, even when it is difficult. Jake felt a surge of hope. His stories were having an effect. The aliens were beginning to think about different kinds of strength and different ways to solve problems. The session continued, but the mood had changed. Instead of angry arguments, the council members began discussing compromise solutions. By the end of the day, they had agreed to form a joint committee to review the mining contracts. As the session ended, Jake noticed that several aliens approached him. A small furry creature from the Woodland Alliance thanked him for the story. Even one of the insect-like beings clicked its mandibles in what Jake had learned was a gesture of respect, but Jake also noticed that Commander Zilthek was watching him carefully. The reptilian commander's red eyes followed Jake as he left the chamber. The next day brought new problems to the council. A border dispute between 2 minor species had escalated into actual fighting. Ships had been destroyed and colonies evacuated. The council needed to act quickly to prevent a full war. Jake, sat in his usual place and listened to the reports. The situation was complicated. Both species claimed the same star system, and both had historical evidence to support their claims. The fighting had started when one side tried to establish a mining operation on a disputed asteroid. "We should send a peacekeeping force," suggested the delegate from the Healing Order, a peaceful species known for their medical skills. "Peacekeeping forces cost money," replied the representative from the Merchant Guild. "Who will pay for such an operation?" The argument went back and forth. Some council members wanted military action, others preferred economic sanctions. A few suggested simply letting the two species fight until one surrendered. Jake saw that the council was deadlocked. No one could agree on a solution. He stood up again. "May I share another story?" he asked. This time, even Commander Zilthik did not object. Jake's stories had become part of the council routine. "Once," Jake began, "there were two neighboring tribes who both claimed the same fertile valley. They had fought over it for generations, and many good people had died in the conflict." Jake was telling them about the founding of the United Nations, but in the form of a simple tribal story. The fighting went on for so long that both tribes became weak. Their young warriors were dead, their resources were exhausted, and their people were starving. The valley they fought over was becoming worthless because the war had destroyed the farms and poisoned the rivers. The council members listened intently. Jake could see that the story was connecting with their current situation. Finally, a wise elder from each tribe met in secret. They realized that continued fighting would destroy both peoples. So they proposed something that had never been tried before. Jake paused for effect. They decided to share the valley. Each tribe would control half the land, but they would work together on projects that benefited both peoples. They would trade with each other, share knowledge, and defend each other against outside threats. "And did this arrangement work?" asked Lyra Voss. "At first there were problems," Jake admitted. "Old hatreds do not disappear overnight." But gradually the two tribes began to prosper. Their children grew up playing together instead of fighting. Their traders became friends. Eventually they became so closely connected that they were more like one people than two separate tribes. "Admiral," Corinth spoke up, "the Keeper suggests that cooperation can be stronger than conflict. But what if one side cheats?" asked the Merchant Guild representative. "What if one tribe takes more than their fair share?" Jake smiled. The wise elders thought of that too. They created a council with representatives from both tribes. This council would settle disputes and make sure the agreement was honored. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jake had just described the basic structure of the Galactic Council itself, but in terms of a simple tribal story, Commander Zilthik stood up slowly. "These stories are interesting, Keeper, but they are just stories. The real world is more complicated." "Perhaps," Jake replied, "but sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones." The council spent the rest of the day discussing Jake's story. By evening, they had agreed to send a mediation team to the disputed system instead of a military force. The two fighting species would be offered a chance to share the resources under Galactic Council supervision. As Jake left the chamber, Lyra Voss caught up with him. "Your stories are having quite an impact," she said. "Some of the council members are beginning to see problems differently." "Stories have power," Jake replied carefully. "They help us understand that there are many ways to solve problems." "Indeed," Lyra Voss said. "I hope you will continue to share your wisdom with us." Jake nodded and continued to his quarters. But he noticed that he was being followed. A small, cloaked figure stayed about 50 meters behind him as he walked through the corridors. When Jake turned corners, the figure turned too. When Jake stopped, the figure stopped. Someone was watching him. Jake wondered if it was one of Commander Zilthik's agents. Jake had been on Nexus Prime for 2 weeks now. His stories were becoming famous throughout the council building. Aliens would stop their conversations when he walked by, hoping to hear another tale. But fame was dangerous for a spy, and Jake could feel the walls closing in around him. The being who had been following him was getting bolder. Jake had spotted the cloaked figure 3 times in the past 2 days, always watching from a distance. He needed to be more careful, but he also needed to continue his mission. Today's council session was different from the others. Jake could feel tension in the air as soon as he entered the chamber. The council members were sitting stiffly in their seats, and several were whispering to each other in worried voices. Commander Zilthak stood up as soon as everyone was seated. His red eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he looked around the chamber. "Fellow council members," he began, "I have disturbing news to share. Our intelligence networks have detected unusual activity in the human colonies." Jake's heart began beating faster, but he kept his expression neutral. He had to act like a curious Zephyrian who knew nothing about humans. "The humans have been building new ships," Commander Zilthak continued. "Not cargo vessels or colony ships, but military vessels. They are preparing for war." Several council members made sounds of alarm. The crystalline delegate, Resonance 7, chimed like broken glass. "War against whom?" "Against us," Commander Zilthak replied. "They know we have rejected their requests for membership in this council. They are preparing to take by force what they cannot gain through diplomacy." Jake wanted to shout that this was not true, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He knew that Earth was building defensive ships, but only because they feared an alien attack. The humans were trying to protect themselves, not start a war. Lyra Voss raised her hand. "Are we certain these ships are intended for offensive purposes? Perhaps the humans are simply defending their colonies." "Defending against what?" Commander Zilthak asked with a snarl. "We have made no threats against them. No, these ships are proof of human aggression. They are a violent species, just as I have always said." The aquatic Admiral Corinth spoke through his breathing device. "What do you propose we do about this situation?" Commander Zilthak's smile was cold and cruel. "We must act before they can complete their preparations. I propose a preemptive strike against the human colonies. We will destroy their ships and remove this threat to galactic peace." The chamber erupted in discussion. Some council members supported the idea, while others argued against it. Jake listened in horror as aliens debated the destruction of human colonies. Millions of innocent people would die if the council approved this plan. "We should not rush into military action," Lyra Voss said firmly. "Perhaps there is another way to resolve this situation." "What other way?" demanded the insect-like delegate from the Hive Collective. "The humans are clearly preparing for war. We must strike first or risk being destroyed ourselves." Jake knew he had to act. He could not let the council vote for war based on false information, but he also could not reveal his true identity without destroying his mission. He needed to find another way. He stood up slowly, drawing attention to himself. "If I may," he said in his disguised voice, "this discussion reminds me of a story from the ancient archives." Commander Zilthak's eyes flashed with anger. "We do not have time for stories, Keeper. We are discussing matters of war and peace." "Perhaps that is exactly when we need stories most," Jake replied. "The ancients often found wisdom in tales of the past." Several council members nodded in agreement. Jake's stories had become popular, and even some of the aliens who supported war were curious to hear what he had to say. "Very well," Commander Zilthak said through gritted teeth. "But make it quick." Jake walked to the center of the chamber. He had to choose his words carefully. The story he was about to tell could save millions of lives, but it could also expose him as a spy. "Long ago," Jake began, "there was a great kingdom that ruled over many lands. This kingdom was powerful and proud, but it was also afraid." Jake was about to tell them about the Warsaw Uprising, but he would present it as an ancient tale about fear and courage. The kingdom's rulers heard rumors that one of their subject peoples was planning a rebellion. These people had been conquered many years before, and they had never fully accepted their new rulers. Jake paused, looking around the chamber. He could see that the council members were listening intently. The kingdom's generals wanted to strike immediately. They said the subject people were dangerous and would attack soon. They demanded permission to destroy the rebel strongholds and execute the leaders. Commander Zilthak leaned forward in his seat. This story seemed to support his position, but the king was wise. Jake continued. He sent a messenger to speak with the leaders of the subject people. The messenger asked them directly, "Are you planning to rebel against us?" "And what did they say?" asked Lyra Voss. Jake took a deep breath. "They said, 'We are not planning to attack you. We are preparing to defend ourselves. We have heard rumors that you plan to destroy us, so we are ready to fight if we must. But we would prefer to live in peace." The chamber fell silent. Jake could see understanding dawning in several faces. The king realized that both sides were afraid of each other, Jake said. The kingdom feared rebellion, and the subject people feared destruction. This fear was driving both sides toward a war that nobody actually wanted. "What did the king do?" asked Admiral Corinth. "He chose to trust instead of fear," Jake replied. "He withdrew his armies and sent diplomats instead. He offered the subject people a choice. They could continue as subjects of the kingdom, or they could become independent allies." "And they chose independence?" "Guess the crystalline delegate? They chose alliance," Jake said. "They realized that working together was better than fighting each other. The kingdom gained loyal allies, and the subject people gained protection and trade partners." Jake finished his story and returned to his seat. The chamber was quiet as the council members thought about what they had heard. Lyra Voss was the first to speak. "The keeper's story suggests that fear can lead to unnecessary conflict. Perhaps we should try to communicate with the humans before taking military action." "Communication is a sign of weakness," Commander Zilfix snarled. "The humans are preparing. For war, we must be ready to fight them." "But what if they are preparing for defense, not offense?" asked the delegate from the Healing Order. "What if they fear us as much as we fear them?" The debate continued for hours. Jake watched as the council slowly divided into two camps. Some members wanted immediate military action while others preferred to try diplomacy first. Finally, a vote was called. Jake held his breath as each council member stated their position. The vote was close, but diplomacy won by a narrow margin. The council agreed to send a message to the human colonies, asking for an explanation of their military preparations. As the session ended, Jake felt both relief and fear. He had prevented an immediate attack on human colonies, but he had also made himself more visible to Commander Zilfek. The reptilian commander's red eyes were fixed on Jake as he left the chamber. Jake was halfway to his quarters when a voice called out behind him, "Keeper Zethmar, please wait." Jake turned to see the cloaked figure who had been following him. The being pushed back his hood, revealing a face that Jake recognized from his training files. It was Agent Skrill, a member of the Vorthan Intelligence Service. "Commander Zilfek wishes to speak with you," Agent Skrill said. "Please come with me." Jake's mind raced. He could try to run, but that would only confirm suspicions. He could try to fight, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. His only choice was to play his role and hope his disguise would hold. "Of course," Jake said calmly. "I would be honored to speak with the commander." Agent Skrill led Jake through corridors he had never seen before. They descended several levels below the main council chambers, entering areas that were clearly restricted to authorized personnel only. Jake memorized every turn, every door, every security checkpoint they passed. Finally, they stopped in front of a heavy metal door marked with Vorthan symbols. Agent Skrill pressed his hand against a scanner, and the door slid open. The room beyond was small and windowless. Commander Zilfek sat behind a metal desk, his red eyes glowing in the dim light. Two other Vorthan agents stood in the corners, their hands resting on their weapons. "Ah, Keeper Zethmar," Commander Zilfek said with a cold smile. "Please, sit down. We have much to discuss." Jake sat in the chair across from the desk. He kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. Had his cover been blown? Did the commander know he was human? "Your stories have become quite popular," Commander Zilfek continued. "Some of my colleagues find them very inspiring. They speak of cooperation, diplomacy, and peaceful solutions to conflict. I am glad they have found value in the ancient Tales," Jake replied carefully. "Yes, the ancient Tales," Commander Zilfek repeated. "That is what I wanted to discuss." With you, you see, I have been studying Zephyrian history and culture. I have access to the most complete archives in the galaxy. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. And I have discovered something very interesting, Commander Zilthek continued. Jake stared at Commander Zilthek's red eyes, his mind racing to find an answer that might save his life. The silence in the small room stretched on, broken only by the quiet breathing of the Vorthan guards in the corners. I see you are thinking carefully about your response, Commander Zilthek said with a cold smile. That is wise. Your next words will determine whether you leave this room alive. Jake decided to take a calculated risk. He could not deny that his stories were not in Zephyrian archives, but he might be able to explain it in a way that would satisfy the commander. You are correct, Commander, Jake said slowly. These stories are not from the official Zephyrian archives. Commander Zilthek's eyes flashed with triumph. So you admit you have been lying to the Council? Not lying, Jake replied. The stories I tell come from a different source. There are Zephyrian communities that live far from our homeworld in the Outer Rim territories. They have their own oral traditions, stories that were never written. Down in the official archives, Jake was improvising now, hoping his knowledge of galactic geography would support his claim. These communities have preserved tales that go back to the earliest days of our species, Jake continued. Stories that were forgotten by the scholars on our homeworld but kept alive by the wandering tribes. Commander Zilthek leaned back in, his chair studying Jake's face. And you learned these stories from these Outer Rim communities? I spent many years traveling among them, Jake said. That is how I earned the title of Keeper. I was chosen to preserve and share these ancient tales. The commander was quiet for a long moment. Jake could see he was trying to decide whether to believe this explanation or not. Even if that is true, Commander Zilthek said finally, there is still something strange about your stories. They all seem to support the same idea that cooperation is better than conquest, that diplomacy is stronger than force. Perhaps that is because these ideas contain wisdom, Jake replied. The ancients learned through experience which approaches work best. Or perhaps, Commander Zilthek said, standing up slowly, these stories are designed to make the Council weak. Perhaps someone is using you to spread ideas that will prevent us from defending ourselves properly. Jake felt the trap closing around him. The commander was suspicious but not yet certain. Jake needed to give him something that would satisfy his doubts without revealing the truth. If I may, Commander, Jake said, perhaps I could share one more story. This one might address your concerns. Commander Zilthek sat back down. Very well, but this had better be convincing. Jake took a deep breath. He was about to tell the most dangerous story of his mission. If he got this wrong, he would be exposed as a human spy. But if he got it right, he might gain the commander's trust. Long ago, Jake began, there was a small group of people who were trapped in a great city by their enemies. The enemy had surrounded the city and was slowly starving the people inside. Jake was telling them about the Warsaw Uprising, but this time he would focus on the darker aspects of the story. The people in the city knew they could not win. They had few weapons and little food. The enemy was too strong and too numerous, but they chose to fight anyway. Commander Zilthek leaned forward with interest. This story sounded different from Jake's previous tales. Why did they choose to fight when they knew they would lose? Jake continued, because they understood something important. Sometimes fighting is not about winning. Sometimes fighting is about showing your enemies that you will never surrender. Jake described the desperate battles in the ruined city, the courage of ordinary people who faced impossible odds, the sacrifice of those who knew they would die but fought anyway. The people in the city held out for months, Jake said. They inflicted heavy losses on their enemies. They showed the world that they would rather die free than live as slaves. And did they win in the end? Asked one of the Vorthan guards. They lost the battle, Jake replied. Most of them died. But they won something more important than the battle. They won respect. Their enemies learned to fear them. And their story inspired other oppressed peoples to resist. Jake finished the story and looked directly at Commander Zilthek. You see, Commander, I do not preach weakness. I tell stories about strength in all its forms. Sometimes strength means cooperation. Sometimes it means standing alone against impossible odds. Commander Zilthik was quiet for a long time. Jake could see he was thinking about the story and what it meant. That is a very different tale from your previous ones, the commander said finally. Each story teaches a different lesson, Jake replied. The ancients understood that life is complex. There is no single answer to every problem. Indeed, Commander Zilthak said. He stood up and walked around the desk to stand in front of Jake. You interest me, Keeper Zethmor. Your stories are educational. Jake remained seated, trying to appear calm despite the danger he was in. I have a proposition for you, Commander Zilthak continued. I want you to tell your stories to a special group of people. My intelligence officers and military commanders could benefit from hearing these ancient tales. Jake felt a chill. If he started telling stories to Vorthan military personnel, they might recognize human historical events. But he could not refuse without arousing more suspicion. I would be honored, Jake said. Excellent, Commander Zilthik replied. We will begin tomorrow. Agent Skrill will escort you to the briefing room at the designated time. The commander nodded to his guards, who moved toward the door. The interrogation was over, but Jake knew he was far from safe. As Jake was escorted back to his quarters, his mind was spinning with worry. He had bought himself time, but he had also walked deeper into danger. Tomorrow he would be telling stories to the very people who might recognize them as human history. Back in his room, Jake sent an urgent coded message to Earth. Cover partially compromised. Mission parameters changing. Require immediate guidance on extraction protocols. The reply came 6 hours later. Extraction not authorized. Mission too valuable to abort. Proceed with extreme caution. Earth believes in you. Jake stared at the message for a long time. Earth was asking him to continue his mission even though his cover was blown. They were willing to risk his life because the intelligence he was gathering was too important to lose. The next morning, Agent Skrill came to escort Jake to the military briefing room. The room was smaller than the council chamber, with about 20 Vorthan officers seated around a conference table. Their red eyes watched Jake with intense curiosity. Commander Zilthak introduced him to the group. Officers, this is Keeper Zethmor. He will be sharing some ancient stories that may provide insight into military strategy and tactics. Jake looked around the room at the assembled officers. These were career soldiers, trained to think about warfare and conquest. They would be much harder to fool than the diverse council members. What kind of story would you like to hear? Jake asked. A young officer raised her hand. Tell us about a great victory. A battle where superior strategy defeated superior numbers, Jake nodded. He was about to tell them about the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal defeated a much larger Roman army through clever tactics. But he would have to be very careful with the details. There was once a general, Jake began, who faced an enemy army twice the size of his own force. As Jake told the story, he watched the officers' faces carefully. They were impressed by the tactical brilliance he described, but he could see some of them taking notes. They were analyzing the battle plan, looking for ways to use it themselves. When Jake finished, the room erupted in discussion. The officers debated the tactics, argued about alternative strategies, and praised the cleverness of the ancient general. Fascinating, said Commander Zilthak. Tell us another story. This time perhaps something about intelligence gathering and espionage. Jake's blood turned cold. The commander was testing him, trying to see if he would reveal knowledge that only a spy would have. Intelligence work is dangerous territory, Jake said carefully. The stories of spies are often tragic ones. All the more reason to hear them, Commander Zilthak replied. We can learn from the mistakes of others. Jake realized he had no choice. He would have to tell a story about espionage. Knowing that every word might expose him as a spy himself, he began to tell them about Nathan Halley, the American spy who was captured and executed during the Revolutionary War. But as Jake spoke about the brave spy who died for his country, he could not help but think about his own situation. Like Nathan Halley, Jake was alone in enemy territory, risking his life for his people. And like Nathan Hale, Jake might soon face the choice between revealing his mission and facing execution. As Jake told the story of the spy's capture and death, he noticed that Commander Zilthek was watching him very closely. The reptilian commander's red eyes seemed to see right through Jake's disguise. When the story ended, Commander Zilthek smiled coldly. That was very enlightening, Keeper. Very enlightening indeed. Jake left the briefing room with the horrible feeling that he had just signed his own death warrant. Commander Zilthek knew something, and Jake was running out of time to complete his mission. That night, Jake lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would return to the council chamber for what might be his final performance. He had one last story to tell. Jake woke up on his 18th day at Nexus Prime, knowing that everything would change today. He had received a message during the night that made his blood run cold. Commander Zilthek had called for an emergency council session to discuss urgent matters of galactic security. Jake dressed in his blue robes and checked his disguise one last time. The synthetic skin was still perfect, but he wondered if it would matter. He had a feeling that today his true identity would be revealed no matter what he did. The council chamber was packed when Jake arrived. Not only were the 12 main council members present, but dozens of advisors, military officers, and intelligence agents filled the observer seats. Jake noticed that many of the Vorthan personnel from yesterday's briefing were in attendance. Commander Zilthek stood at the center of the chamber, his red eyes gleaming with satisfaction. In his clawed hands he held a datapad that Jake suspected contained information about him. Fellow council members, Commander Zilthek began, I have discovered a threat to our security that has been hiding among us for weeks. Jake felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him. He remained in his seat, trying to appear confused like any innocent Zephyrian would be. Our friend Keeper Zethmer has been entertaining us with stories, the commander continued. But I have discovered that these stories are not what they seem to be. Lyra Voss looked concerned. What do you mean, Commander? I mean that these stories do not come from Zephyrian archives at all, Commander Zilthek replied. They come from the historical records of another species entirely. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Jake remained seated, but his mind was racing. How much did the commander actually know? Furthermore, Commander Zilthek continued, my intelligence analysis suggests that these stories have been carefully chosen to influence our decisions. Someone has been using them to manipulate this council. Admiral Corinth spoke through his breathing device. Are you suggesting that Keeper Zethmer is a spy? I am suggesting more than that, Commander Zilthek said with a cold smile. I am suggesting that he is a human spy. The chamber fell completely silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat as hundreds of alien eyes stared at him. That is a serious accusation, Lyra Voss said. Do you have proof? Commander Zilthek activated his datapad, and a holographic display appeared above the chamber. It showed images from human historical records side by side with transcripts of Jake's stories. The Battle of Thermopylae, Commander Zilthek said, pointing to ancient Greek records. The expansion of the Roman Empire, the Warsaw Uprising. These are all events from human history, not Zephyrian legends. Jake knew his cover was completely blown. There was no point in pretending anymore. He stood up slowly and looked around the chamber. Yes, he said, dropping his disguised voice and speaking in his natural human tone. I am Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison of Earth's Intelligence Division. The chamber exploded with angry voices. Several council members demanded his immediate execution, while others called for security guards to arrest him, but Jake was not finished. He raised his voice above the noise. Before you decide what to do with me, I have one more story to tell. We have heard enough of your lies, Commander. Zilthek snarled. This is not a lie, Jake replied. This is the truth about my people. Lyra Voss held up her hand for silence. Let him speak. We should hear what he has to say. The chamber gradually became quiet. Jake walked to the center of the room, knowing that these might be the last words he ever spoke. You want to know about humans, Jake began. You think we are violent and primitive. You believe we are a threat to galactic peace. So let me tell you the real story of humanity. Jake looked around at the alien faces watching him. Some showed anger, others curiosity, but all were listening. We are not an ancient species like many of you, Jake continued. We have only been traveling between stars for a few hundred years. By galactic standards, we are children. Jake described humanity's journey from a single world to the stars. He spoke about the first moon landing when humans looked up at their satellite and decided to visit it. He told them about the courage of explorers who risked everything to reach Mars. We made mistakes, Jake admitted. We fought wars among ourselves. We damaged our home planet through ignorance and greed, but we learned from our mistakes. He described how humanity had overcome its divisions, how different nations had learned to work together, how they had cleaned up their polluted world and reached for the stars. The ships you detected around our colonies are defensive, Jake said. We built them because we were afraid. We knew there were older, more powerful species in the galaxy. We thought you might attack us, Commander Zilthek snorted. Fear does not excuse military buildup. You are right, Jake replied. But neither does suspicion excuse planning a preemptive war. The chamber stirred as Jake's words hit home. He had just revealed that he knew about the planned attack on human colonies. Yes, I know about your military plans, Jake continued. That is why I came here. Not to spy on your weapons or steal your technology, but to try to prevent a war that would hurt both our peoples. Jake paused, looking directly at Commander Zilthek. You asked me who I really am? I'm a soldier who chose to risk his life for peace instead of preparing for war. Lyra Voss leaned forward in her seat. Why should we believe anything you say? You have been lying to us for weeks. Because, Jake said, everything I told you about cooperation and working together came from human history. These were not alien legends. They were stories about my own people learning to be better than they were. Jake described the founding of the United Nations, the end of apartheid, the fall of the Berlin Wall. He spoke about humans who had chosen peace over violence, cooperation over conquest. The humans you fear do exist, Jake said. We can be violent and stubborn and proud, but we can also be something else. We can be the species that chooses to build bridges instead of walls. Admiral Corinth spoke up. You infiltrated our council. You deceived us all? How can we trust anything you say? Because I am here, Jake replied simply. I could have gathered intelligence and left quietly. I could have reported your military plans and let our species prepare for war. Instead, I chose to stand here and tell you the truth, knowing that it might cost me my life. The chamber was quiet as the council members considered Jake's words. Finally, Lyra Voss spoke. What do you want from us? Give humanity a chance, Jake said. Send ambassadors to our worlds. Meet with our leaders. Learn who we really are instead of who you think we are. And if we refuse? Commander Zilthek asked. Then you will have to live with the consequences, Jake replied. But remember that war creates enemies, while peace creates allies. The council debated for hours. Jake was taken to a holding cell while they discussed his fate and the future of human-alien relations. He sat in the small room, wondering if he would live to see the result of his mission. Finally, Lyra Voss came to see him. Her expression was unreadable as she sat down across from him. The council has reached a decision, she said. By a vote of 7-5, we have agreed to postpone military action against the human colonies. Jake felt relief flood through him. Furthermore, Lyra Voss continued, we have agreed to send a diplomatic mission to Earth. We want to meet with your leaders and discuss the possibility of peaceful relations. And what happens to me? Jake asked. Lyra Voss smiled for the first time since he had known her. You will be our first human ambassador to the Galactic Council. That is, if you accept the position. Jake stared at her in amazement. You want me to stay? Your stories changed how we see humanity, she replied. Several council members believe that a species capable of producing someone like you deserves a chance to prove themselves. Even Commander Zilthek? Especially Commander Zilthek, Lyra Voss said. He was impressed by your courage. He said that any species brave enough to send a single spy to infiltrate the Galactic Council might be worthy of respect. Jake sent his final message to Earth that night. Mission successful beyond all expectations. Diplomatic contact established. Request immediate follow-up team. Story still being written. As he looked out his window at the alien city below, Jake smiled. He had come to Nexus Prime as a spy, but he was staying as an ambassador. His stories had not only prevented a war, they had opened the door to friendship between humans and the galaxy. The human adventure among the stars was just beginning.